Okay, I'm back for the third in the What is Popular Cultural series. This one is titled The Industrial Revolution. It's probably better to call it The Effects of the Industrial Revolution. If you're not sure what the Industrial Revolution is, definitely go back and look over that. You'll find it in any good world history textbook. But we're going to move through it really quickly. So even before the Industrial Revolution, as England went through, a population explosion as a result of the Second Agricultural Revolution after 1730, there were social commentators, intellectuals, and others who were trying to understand the implications of population growth and then industrial change on society. And these people included really important and famous philosophers like Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, some of the very first economists, particularly in the capitalist and liberal tradition, and Mikhail Bakunin, an anarchist, among many others. So it also led to the development of new theories about how the economy worked, driven largely by the idea of the Enlightenment that the natural laws about human behavior could be discovered and applied. A number of thinkers began to try to understand the economy and its impact on society in scientific terms. And here you see a factory floor. This is actually from the early 20th century, so it's quite modern compared with what we're looking at, which is starting in the 1730s. So Thomas Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834, and David Ricardo, who lived from 1772 to 1823, so really exactly at the same time, right? Both studied the relationship between industry, society, and money. Their work, some of the earliest we can identify as economics, right, seemed to suggest that a large gap between the wealthy and the rest of society, a social class differentiation, was both natural and immutable. That is, unchangeable. Can't get rid of it. Malthus was the first economist to study population and its relation to supply. Malthus analyzed the population growth curve of England based on data he collected from village graveyards and census data when it was available. And he discovered that population was growing at what we would call, I guess, mathematically a logarithmic rate. The curve on a Malthusian chart clearly is more than a multiplication of population. Instead, a logarithmic rate, right, would be, for instance, two adults have two children, you have a population of four. Those two children each have two children of their own, you have a population of eight, right? And this just keeps growing at a logarithmic rate. So this is very fast growth. And the Industrial Revolution did, you can see in global population charts, but particularly English and European ones, the beginnings of high population growth rates, much higher than the rest of earlier human history. So Malthus then combined that logarithmic population growth chart with the high levels, and they were high levels, of growth in the food supply that England had been seeing since the 18th century, what we call the New Agricultural Revolution. And when he published his study in 1798, the curve that he showed predicted that population growth, even though food growth was growing quickly, population growth was growing more quickly and would outstrip food supply, leading to the Malthusian trap. And this is a common economic term, right? The Malthusian trap, in which population could no longer continue to grow because there would not be enough food to support it. According to Malthus, that would lead to a sudden decline in population and in production. In this kind of population trap, the working class appears to be stuck with no way to bridge the gap between itself and the comfort and security available to the wealthy. Worse, this appears to be a natural condition that is, therefore, right, inescapable. Ricardo became an economist after reading Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and dedicated his career to analyzing the way the economy worked during the Industrial Revolution, which was in many ways the frame of his own life, right? He lived through some of the most important changes in the early Industrial Revolution, occurring about the same time as his life, right? So perhaps Ricardo's greatest contribution was his labor theory of value. In it, he claimed that wages were stuck in a kind of economic trap, which he thought of as a natural equilibrium. High wage periods encouraged laborers to have children because they had enough money to have a family. More children might provide more labor and increase the wealth of the family, right? But this would have the effect of creating a growing population, which would mean more laborers than jobs, which would depress wages, right? So this is an early application of what we might call the supply-demand system. So Ricardo suggested that wages would never rise above nor drop below subsistence level for laborers in an industrial society, in large part because of Malthus' population trap. So once again, laborers were seen as trapped by nature. Such ideas encouraged the wealthy and aristocrats to see themselves as a distinct sector of humanity that was born to be wealthy, powerful, and simply better than the working class. These attitudes also encouraged the wealthy to claim cultural activities that had been shared, right? Shakespeare, for example, was not always a high cultural activity. It was a shared cultural activity. Wealthy and commoners went to Shakespeare plays together, enjoyed them. These new attitudes about wealth and poverty, the wealth trap, etc., encouraged the wealthy to claim these cultural activities as suitable only for themselves. And this is because they claimed that only they had the education and refinement to understand and make use of it. Of course, to some degree that may have been true because they were the only ones who could afford the time and effort to get an education, right? But their belief in this was to some degree the result of the increasing popularity of the ideas of what we'll call classical liberalism. So what was classical liberalism? Classical liberalism was a way of thinking about how society works based on the new ideas of the Industrial Revolution. From the thinkers of the Enlightenment, particularly Thomas Hobbes and John Locke is pictured here, classical liberals believed that society was no more than a collection of individuals, and that each individual had necessarily to find a way to support her or his or her own life through individual efforts. You as an individual are responsible for your life. This meant that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, according to John Locke. Well, if this sounds like the American Revolution, you're absolutely right. Locke was one of its major influencers. So the people as individuals, right, now redefined from Roman and then medieval times, no longer as commoners, but as individuals who tacitly agree to a social contract. Therefore, government had to be, to some degree, made up of the will of those who were governed. The most common way to do this was through an electoral system. Constitutional, legal, and political systems, as well as nation states, were ideas that were consistent with classical liberalism. Now, they're not directly out of classical liberalism, but certainly classical liberal ideas support these ideas of constitutional and legal political systems. In the same way, classical liberals believed that all members of an economic unit, which was defined usually as within a nation state, had individual economic needs and skills which they traded with other theoretical with each other in theoretical spaces that they called the market. Okay? Many came to believe that success in trade marked them as more intelligent and capable than others. Adam Smith's ideas about capitalism are based on these notions, as well as the notion of production efficiency through the cooperation of individuals. So individuals can cooperate and do cooperate when they all find it to their benefit to do so, according to liberal ideas. So capitalism, for Smith, was a complex theory based on the classical liberal idea of the individual in the marketplace using his or her capital, his wealth, to generate more wealth for himself by competing with others to make profitable trades and manufacturing goods that could be traded profitably. Much of Smith's thought came from his understanding of the way colonial economy of the Americas worked. These are the American colonies in the New World. For classical liberals, each individual seeks to trade labor and skills within the market for the goods he or she needs to survive. Right? So this brings us back to Ricardo's labor theory of value. That is, for Ricardo, labor is the equivalent of goods or the equivalent of money. Right? It is a tradable commodity that belongs to the individual and can be traded for other things that the individual wants or needs. The human society then is made up of material trades. In the market, employers look for laborers who can do the work they need and bargain based on the value of that labor and the price the market will bear for the finished product. Labor seeks to maximize its value, and employers seek to minimize their labor costs. So classical liberals believed that the negotiation of a labor contract happened between a single laborer and a single employer. To them, the organization of laborers into bargaining groups was antithetical to the principle of individualism, and thus it was a bad idea. So this is not too different from the argument during and after the American and French revolutions, and continuing today, right? That as to whether political parties are admissible in a democracy, right? For the same reasons, political parties, right? In the same way a labor organization is not individualist, a political party is an anti-individualist affiliation that warps social norms according to liberal beliefs. Classical liberals understood Smith's idea. The market was a space of negotiation in which buyers would pay only the price which a product was worth to them, and employers would be kept from offering inferior products or from charging high prices because of a constant negotiation of buyers and sellers. In many ways, they equated individualism and capitalism with natural reality and believed that humans created associations and dissolved them based on the degree to which these associations worked for the majority of their members. Much of this theory is relevant for the way that popular culture works in our society today. You may have noticed that I often refer to popular culture products. This is because popular culture functions in our world within the economic and social space we have, after classical liberalism, come to call the market. Karl Marx, a German intellectual and historian, recognized the redistributive powers of Smith's capitalism. Now, this is important. Marx recognized that the change from commoners as a social group locked in their own social class to classical liberalism, in which people were thought of as individuals with the ability to negotiate their own labor value, was redistributive. That is, it tended to create a redistribution of wealth from the top to the larger group of people. And Marx recognized this as a very good thing, a positive change in the world. Marx was less a social and political activist than a historian in the Enlightenment vein, right? He hoped to find evidence of natural laws that would explain how history works, what motivates change in human societies, right? After many years of study in 1848, Marx came to believe that he had found the answer. Now, I don't want to present Marx as totally objective either, right? He had personal issues and certainly was horrified by the poverty that was caused to the working class during the Industrial Revolution, and those influenced his thought. but his goal was primarily a history of human change rather than political activism, at least at first, right? Um, anyway, after many years of study, in 1848, Marx came to believe he found the answer. Society, he thought, was based not on human desires for freedom or romantic ideas about nation or God or purpose, but instead on continuous attempts to accumulate the material things, right, the stuff that we need to live. So it's not about beliefs, it's about what you need to live and thrive. In many ways, this is really not so different from John Locke, right? For Marx, the story of history was the story of this attempt to accumulate the necessities of survival writ large. He claimed to see a pattern in history whereby human society was made up of social classes, each of which was a bit poorer in material terms than the last. Each second-level class, he thought, would eventually take an opportunity to displace the people in the higher class, right, and take control of the wealth and power in society. Over time, according to Marx, this process continually reduced the number of social classes until he thought, in his own time, and he published his book Capital in 1848, there were only two classes left. The townspeople, what he called burghers or bourgeoisie, whom he equated with ownership of the means of production, right? That is money or factories or sources of energy for factories. And then the other class, the proletariat or workers, whom he saw as the people who worked for the bourgeoisie in a labor relationship. Marx believed that because the bourgeoisie had the money and provided the work, laborers were at a disadvantage in Smith's market, right, when negotiating for wages. Since factory owners had so much money, or capital, they could negotiate from a position of power. And since there were so many laborers who needed the money, similar to Ricardo's iron law of wages, the market forced workers to accept jobs at wages that were unfairly cheap because individual negotiation with the employer was not possible. If the employer's employing 100 people and you decide that you as an individual are not paid enough, you could complain to your boss, and your boss will, as often as not, say, okay, well, find another job because I can replace you with someone else who will work for these wages, right? So for Marx, that individual negotiation with the business owner does not work. It has to be a group organization, right? So otherwise, the market forces workers to accept jobs at wages that are unfairly cheap. If they complained, they could easily be replaced. Marx believed that eventually the proletariat, the workers, would see themselves as a group who were being cheated by the bourgeoisie, and they would rise up and take the wealth of the bourgeoisie, violently if necessary, and Marx believed it was going to be necessary. For Marx, this was less a political stance than it was what he thought of as a scientifically discovered way that history would work. The revolution, he thought, was inevitable because he believed his history to be based on factual evidence and a scientific analysis. So he believed that his history had predictive quality. Well, Marx's social class analysis opened a way to understand popular culture as much as Smith's capitalist ideas of individual and marketplace did. In a Marxist state, the state will eventually be controlled by the proletariat. There will be only one social class. By extension, that means that the culture of the upper classes, what Theodor Adorno would later call high culture, right, would no longer be necessary or even applicable because there was no upper class, right, in a new communist state. So this led to questions about what made up culture and what was its purpose. For Marxists, one answer to this question came to be that culture should be mass culture, culture for everyone. It should reach all people with one message: support for the goals of the proletariat. Now, if that sounds like propaganda, well, remember that for Marxists, there is no one to be propagandizing because there is no state, there's no upper class that's trying to convince anyone. In other words, it's not considered propaganda, it's considered didactic or educational, right? The proletariat needs to continuously learn and remember that it is the proletariat. that led to a critique of Adorno's high culture and the way in which it supported the social class differences that repressed the working class. However, that cultural critique also shined a light on so-called low culture, right? Adorno talked about low culture, the culture of the masses, the working class, right? And some Marxists assumed that all of this culture would be useful because it came from the working classes. But many thought differently. Many agreed with Adorno, right? They came to think of commoner culture as also supporting perceptions of class difference, that culture was designed, like we talked about in the first of these lectures, to emphasize the difference between the rulers and the ruled, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so because it supported class difference rather than supporting single class power of the proletariat, they also came to think of commoner culture as bad, right? And many saw commoner culture as bawdy, right? Mostly about sex or silliness or bodily functions or that sort of thing. So much commoner culture just didn't make sense according to this analysis. And if you really look back on, well, take Yankee Doodle for example, right? That's a song that has been politicized, but it's also a commoner song, and in many ways it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So this led to disillusionment among Marxists who thought that popular culture should be mass culture, it should come from the proletariat. These cultural theorists became determined to make Marxist culture didactic, to make it educational. In the Soviet Union, after World War I, popular culture became a tool to be used to educate the masses about their former enslavement to factory owners and landed aristocrats, and to teach the goals of the Russian Revolution and of Marxism. It was critical to find ways to prevent mass culture and popular culture from working within the market in a way that supported the power of capital. So this often, though not always, led to the idea that the state should monitor and control culture to support Marxism. With these two differing ideas about the value and effects of culture, modern cultural studies theory was born. The question about whether culture had didactic value was key. If it did all culture have that value or only some? Was there such a thing as useless culture and useful culture? Was it possible or even desirable to make all culture useful in some way? Theorist Theodor Adorno, a German cultural studies theorist who used Marxist theories of class, right, to access the value of culture, claimed in his article, The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, divided culture into high culture, which was didactic, had great value, and was consumed mostly by the educated, wealthy, upper classes, and low culture, which had little, if any, educational value or importance, and was created and consumed mostly by the uneducated, poor working people. Worse, according to Adorno and his co-author Max Horkheimer, capitalism commodified all culture and turned low culture into a system of propaganda that helped keep the working class subservient and fooled them into complacence. It became mass culture, the culture all pervaded by an industry set up to reproduce simple culture of low value to be cheaply consumed by those who knew no better. They knew no better because their brains were rotted by the poor quality and lack of educational content, and they cared less because the makers of mass culture, the quote-unquote culture industry, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, made no secret about its existence and industrial organization. So Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer from the culture industry, right, they were talking about this, and I'm just going to quote them here. Under monopoly, all mass culture is identical, and the lines of its artificial framework begin to show through. The people at the top are no longer so interested in concealing monopoly. As its violence becomes more open, so its power grows. Movies and radio need no longer pretend to be art. The truth that they are just business is made into an ideology in order to justify the rubbish they deliberately produce. They call themselves industries, and when their directors' incomes are published, any doubt about the social utility of the finished product is removed. So under this model, popular culture seemed to be about only mass production and profits, and popular culture products were therefore part of a mass propaganda effort to force their audience to consume whatever the industry wanted to produce. The audience was considered to be passive, accepting whatever they were given, and simple, fooled by the industry into imagining they liked it. Distribution of popular culture at the time of Adorno and Horkheimer, Horkheimer's writing about 1944 was primarily by radio, film, and newspaper. And all of these methods are passive in the sense that they offer no direct method for interaction. Radio listeners are just that, listeners, right? They cannot talk back to the radio announcer. Well, they can, but the radio announcer won't hear them, right? Movies are the same. Audiences go to watch, not to interact with movies. Newspapers do offer limited interaction in the form of letters to the editor or op-ed pieces, but these require readers to be literate and able to write back to the newspaper, and the editors have the ability to pick and choose what to print. So it follows that they only print what's good for themselves. Thus, there is no way to interact with, let alone argue with, these media. And this is the source of Adorno and Horkheimer's complaint, that mass culture is not culture at all, but propaganda. So, now that you kind of have an understanding of these basics and the study of popular culture, next week we're going to go on to Asia and to more recent theories that have superseded Adorno and Horkheimer and Marxism. But this is the essential background, and you do need to remember it. We'll be using it as we start to do our own analyses of popular culture products. We'll also be looking into some ideas about design and ideas about film and how film is made. That includes video, right? In order to play with our emotions. So we're looking at those as well to understand not just theories about what popular culture does and what its effects are, but also how it actually functions. All right. Have a good day.